I hate labels, whether they're attached to us personally or attached to a church. Okay? Then they did the same thing with the prosperity message. And people become anti-prosperity. And I'm always like, okay, so what are you, pro-poverty? But granted, what they do is they talk about the people that went way too far, and they really weren't preaching prosperity. They were preaching greed. And we ought not to dignify that by attaching a biblical word to it, and then we become anti it. And now there's the hyper grace, and the next one coming down the pike is hyper love. And so here's what I want to say to you, that if I can't even mention a word, if I say prosperity and you're like, ew, you're prejudiced. Because you're assuming you know where I'm coming from and what I'm about to say, and because you're making an assumption based on incomplete information, you're building your own wall. And you'll become stagnant in your growth when you can't even let God speak to you. Right? And so like when my friend came to me about the hyper grace message, the insinuation was about a certain preacher, and I asked him, I said, have you ever read one of his books? He said, no. I said, have you ever listened to one of his sermons? I said, no. And yet you're labeling him. So this is all I'm going to put up on the screen, if you would. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4. I'm going to read 2 verses, and this will be not the complete sermon, but it'll be enough for you to go home on. And understand that if we're going to walk into the season of the new, we can't hold on to the old like it's something sacred. Even in the order of our services. When we first started RLC, I longed for the day where we start with the sermon, and when you walk in late, because you know you're always late for worship, you're going to walk in and I'm going to be halfway through my sermon. And you're going to wonder, wait, we don't do it this way. Says who? Where's it written? Worship must cometh firsteth. And what if we started off with the sermon? You know why most preachers don't start off with the sermon? Because they want to preach to a full house, so they let the worship team sing to a half house. Hello? But you're going to walk in one day, and I'm going to be halfway through, and then you're going to hear the whole worship service. But 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4, and this is just the introduction, and we'll pick it up later, the promise of provision. We read this last week, and I want to draw it out again because this is what God's trying to do for us. 2 Peter chapter 1, verse 4 out of the Passion Translation says, as a result of this, he has given you magnificent promises that are beyond all price. You know, they're magnificent promises because they're the promises of a magnificent Father. A magnificent Father can only make magnificent promises. So he has given you magnificent promises that are beyond all price, so that through the power of these tremendous promises, you can experience partnership. And remember, we camped on that a little bit last week with the divine nature, by which you have escaped the corrupt desires that are of the world. And remember that God's promises are insights into his character. This is why there's never been a promise that was too good to be true. Because they're the promises of God. So the promises of God are insights into his character, and faith is nothing other than the conviction that God is not a liar. As long as we're able to entertain the idea that God's not completely truthful and faithful, there's room for unbelief. But when we, like Paul said, become convinced, have a conviction that God is absolutely faithful and always truthful, then there's no room for unbelief.